Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Total Survey Design Podcast. My name is Azdran. In this episode, I discuss whether or not to include a neutral middle response option in survey questions, or if respondents should be forced to choose a side. In Likert scaled questions and other similar bipolar questions, neutral options usually live in odd-numbered scales, 3-point, 5-point, 7-point scales, and so on. So there's no true mathematical midpoint. So if you ever have a question that asks you to rate something on a scale from strongly support to strongly oppose, the middle option may simply be neither support nor oppose. On the other hand, a fourth choice question is a survey item that requires respondents to select an option from a predefined set with no neutral ground. No, don't know, or not applicable escape hatch. The defining feature is that respondents cannot sit on the fence. Now, there are good arguments for and against including a neutral option. On the one hand, you want responses that are exhaustive and exclusive. On the other hand, you want to avoid getting a bunch of responses that are just indecisive neutral responses that don't really say much of anything. But you'll see in this episode why there are good arguments for both sides, and how including a neutral option is really going to depend on a case-by-case basis. Now, let's dive into this whole debate so that you can be better informed about when to include a neutral response option. I've been thinking a lot about this issue, on whether to include a middle response option in questions or just force people to pick a side, because it really does change how people answer a question and what kind of story your data ends up telling. I've heard some survey designers argue that we should never include a neutral option. But from everything that I know, everything that I've learned and talked about with other researchers, and all that I've seen on my own surveys, there is genuinely no universal right answer. It depends so much on what you're measuring, who you're asking, and what you ultimately want to do with the results. Some of the most common forms of forced choice questions include even number scales, such as a 4-point or 6-point agreement scale with no middle. Questions that force users to pick one of two dichotomous or binary choices, such as yes, no, or A-B, or pairwise items, where you must choose between one of two statements. A lot of people just tend to gravitate towards being neutral. That's just a behavioral fact. Sometimes people are less decisive, sometimes they're just less confrontational. But in the end, it may lead to an unnatural clustering of neutral selections, which can compress variance slightly and change correlations slightly. But none of this is automatically bad. It's only bad if you weren't expecting it or if it hides something you actually care about. With proper pre-testing of your survey and testing your specific questions and question response options against the population, your data will tell you more than anything else. There are also very strong arguments for taking the neutral option out and for forcing people to lean one way or the other. The biggest argument for ditching the neutral scale is that the neutral option can become the lazy default for many. Of course, not every neutral response reflects low effort. In many cases, it represents genuine ambivalence or uncertainty. A major argument for removing the neutral is that it becomes a default for satisficers, respondents who want to finish with minimal effort. Think aloud studies show that a meaningful portion of neutral selections come from people with mild leanings who don't want to commit. When the neutral box sits in the middle, it's the easiest choice. They click it without thinking. Forced choice removes that easy out and pushes people to reveal more of their true attitude. Second, the neutral choice hides true attitudes. People sometimes use neutral to avoid taking a stand when they actually do have a preference, whether due to social desirability bias, fear of appearing extreme, or simply not wanting to be accountable. Forced choice pushes those hidden leanings into the open. However, it also pushes some respondents to select an option that only weakly reflects their true position. So the trade-off is not trivial. In political polling, market research, and employment engagement surveys, researchers often find that removing the neutral reveals sharper differences and more actionable patterns. And another strong argument, when you're running into a survey to support a real world decision, launching a product or changing a policy or allocating a budget, having a huge chunk of your respondents, say 30 or 40% of respondents, clustered in the neutral can paralyze action or muddy priorities. Still, from a measurement standpoint, accurately capturing widespread neutrality may be more important than producing a clean directional split. Forced choice formats tend to deliver cleaner directional signals, even if they introduce a bit more measurement error at the individual level. Third, central tendency bias. Some people, and this varies by culture, tend to avoid extremes and cluster towards the middle of any scale. When you give them a neutral option, you amplify that bias. At the same time, removing that midpoint does not eliminate central tendency bias entirely. It may simply redistribute it towards adjacent categories. An even number scaled forces them to break the habit and reveal more variance, which can be really helpful if you're trying to segment your audience or identify strong supporters versus detractors. One frequently cited piece of evidence is a 2019 Pew Research Center experiment. In their research, they tested a select all that apply version of a question against the forced choice yes/no of the same question. And the forced choice version produced, on average, about 8% points higher reporting. People appeared more willing to disclose sensitive experiences when forced to answer each item in a list individually, rather than scanning a list and selecting all that apply. Even so, differences like this may reflect format effects rather than purely deeper disclosure, so interpretation should remain cautious. One reason might be because when someone skips an item in a select all that apply, it is unclear if they simply missed the item by accident or if they purposefully chose not to select it. Using a forced yes/no format clarifies their respondent's intent by requiring them to explicitly indicate their response for each option. And building on this, the effects of forced choice formats extend beyond clarifying individual responses. They also address broader concerns in survey-based decision-making. By requiring respondents to make a clear choice, forced choice questions can help overcome indecision and provide more actionable data, especially in situations where neutrality might hinder progress or mask underlying opinions. Which brings us to the fourth argument in favor of forced choice questions. It is that they help with decision making when it needs clarity. And lastly, some classic studies, especially in customer satisfaction and political science, have shown that when you remove the neutral, the overall distribution doesn't just split evenly, it often tips more decisively towards one side than you would have predicted from the neutral included version. That suggests that neutral was masking real underlying preferences. But it also indicates that respondents with weak or mixed attitudes were redistributed into the closest available category. Now I'm going to talk about why I and a lot of other people still lean towards keeping the neutral option most of the time, especially in those questions with polar response options. First of all, the most fundamental principle of question design is to ensure your response options are both exhaustive and inclusive. In other words, you want to ensure that each respondent has an option that they can select that represents how they want to respond to that question, and that those options are not overlapping. And statistically speaking, if you have a normal distribution of responses, you can objectively expect that at least some of the responses will fall into that neutral category. Even if your bell curve leans towards one end of the scale, you are still going to have a proportion of the population that is going to cover that neutral area of the scale. The fact of the matter is that with a Likert scale question, including a neutral option lets people be more honest when they really don't have a strong opinion either way. Of course, this assumes that neutrality is substantively meaningful for the construct being measured. While some of us, especially business owners or type A go-getters, have strong opinions on everything, not everyone has a fully formed stance on every issue. Sometimes people are ambivalent, but that doesn't mean that it isn't true to who they are. And it's okay if not everyone is not a type A, super opinionated, and super decisive business leader. Sometimes someone just might not have thought about an issue enough to take a side. And in those cases, forcing them to pick a side can create more noise than a neutral ever does. Or in a question where the ambivalent respondent isn't sure how to respond, they might resort to guessing randomly if they are forced to choose a side. Pick whatever feels socially safer, or get annoyed and drop out of the survey completely. All of those are worse for data quality than letting someone say, neutral. And what's worse is that in some cases where a respondent may think they know what kind of response the researcher wants to hear, the data can be even more harmed. Like if a researcher is asking whether a program has been socially helpful to a welfare recipient. Social desirability bias will influence people to lean more towards a positive response than a negative one. Second, the state of neutrality is a real psychological state. Real attitudes aren't always polarized, especially on complex topics such as climate policy details, organizational change initiatives, certain ethical questions. People can simultaneously see good arguments on both sides. Capturing genuine ambivalence makes your results more ecologically valid. It reflects how people actually think rather than forcing artificial clarity. Third, including the neutral tends to improve respondent experience and completion rates. People hate feeling trapped by a question that doesn't fit. When they can pick a neutral option, they're less likely to skip the item or abandon the whole survey. Higher completion rates matter a lot when you're already fighting low response rates. Fourth, and this one gets overlooked a lot, several studies have found that scales with a neutral midpoint often show slightly higher internal consistency, or Cronbach's alpha, and better factor loading in exploratory analysis, especially for attitudes and personality constructs. The reasoning is that forcing a choice can introduce random error or method variance that wasn't present before. So, ironically, the softer scale with the neutral can actually be more reliable in some contexts. That said, reliability patterns can differ across topics and populations, so this is not a guaranteed outcome. And finally, fifth, when you're doing exploratory or descriptive work, trying to map out how people feel rather than test a direction hypothesis, the neutral gives you richer information. You can see not just which side wins, but how many people are sitting on the fence, how polarized the topic really is, and where indifference lives. This kind of nuance is important in early stage research, program evaluation, or organizational diagnostics. So, where does that leave us? If we weigh the pros and cons of including a neutral response option, the evidence shows that the benefits outweigh the drawbacks. Even so, reasonable researchers can disagree, and the optimal choice ultimately depends on the construct, the respondents, and the purpose of the survey. I also believe that good survey design can address many of the arguments for removing the neutral response option. So let's talk about some potential solutions to figuring out whether or not to include a neutral option in questions. If people have a central tendency bias, you can spend time wording your question and the introduction of your survey in a way that may reduce this bias. You can explain to people that having views that may not align with how people expect them to respond is okay. And remember, good survey design practice means thinking holistically about survey design. It is about the total design method, thinking about all the parts of the survey design process. Using social exchange theory helps create an environment where respondents are comfortable answering in a way that may be more honest. When a respondent has more trust in the survey researcher and views the researcher as a positive authority, people are more likely to provide better data and be less lazy. Another remedy for including the neutral option, especially if you're worried about too many neutral responses, is to pre-test to ensure that you have enough resolution in your response options. Sometimes a respondent might not feel strongly in either direction, but they might feel more comfortable stating that they lean a certain way. If you have too few options, or if they are worded in a way that does not invite nuance, the solution might be to tinker with the wording itself, or with adding higher degrees of response options, such as increasing the number of points from 3 to 5 or to 7 or even more points. And sometimes people want to see that option that is just slightly off from the neutral option. And finally, while a neutral option works well for genuine ambivalence, for cases of pure ignorance, consider including a I don't know or not applicable as a separate options. Or also include in the question statement that respondents are allowed to skip the question if they are unsure about how to answer. But I also want to share an elegant solution to including the neutral option. Let's take, for example, a question that measures political identity. We know that 98% of the voting population votes for either Democrat or Republican in general elections. So, if we are researching polarization, we might be testing a theory of polarization, and something I've actually done before and published on myself. We might be tempted to simply ask respondents how they identify politically and give them only the choice between Democrat and Republican. I mean, if 98% of the respondents fit in one of those two categories, then what does it mean if you're only missing 2% of the data? Does that really make a really big difference? Well, one elegant way to get the best of both worlds is to have a two-question approach. First, ask the full question with the neutral option. And then you follow up with the second question for those who chose that neutral option and ask a gentle follow-up. If you had to choose, do you lean more towards one or the other? This preserves the truth distribution while creating a forced variable for any analysis that demands it. So here's the thing. When I asked my 800 respondents whether they identified as Democrats, Republicans, or Independents, about 30% said they identified as Independents. But that's a good thing. That's more reflective of the true distribution of the population. And the more we understand how the population truly feels, the better we scientists can understand the social and political forces that influence people. I still had a problem. Many of the papers that I cited in my paper discussed political polarization, but mostly in terms of Democrat versus Republican. My own paper focused on a mechanism that explained the differences between Republicans and Democrats. So, my solution was to ask a follow-up to the original political identity question. And just to recap, the first question asked whether respondents identified as a Democrat, a Republican, or independent. And the second follow-up question asked only those independents, if you had to choose, do you lean more Democrat or Republican? Then all of those independents are filtered into either a soft Democrat or soft Republican. This is the solution that I learned from the American National Election Study, and it has been used by other reputable survey organizations such as Gallup and Pew Research. And this way, I accomplished two things. I preserved the original data that includes the neutral response option, and I also created a second variable that combines the first and second questions into a two-category variable of Democrat and Republican. So here's the bottom line. The decision to include a neutral option or forced in response choices should really be considered on a case-by-case basis. Forced choices are great when we have a list of a select all that apply type question. And instead of the select all that apply choice, they are forced to select a yes/no response for each item. Yet on the other hand, when we include a neutral option in polarized response options, if neutrality is substantively meaningful, we're not only collecting better data, but we are also showing respect for the real complexity of human thought. But the key phrase here is if neutrality is substantively meaningful, because in some cases, a directional measure may more accurately reflect the construct of interest. We are building surveys that listen to and respect their respondents, instead of just demanding them pick a side. And that small act of trust will lead to a richer and more accurate insights, stronger decisions, and ultimately, research that actually moves the world forward. If you've made it this far, please make sure that you are subscribed to the podcast. And if you have any other questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at totalsurveydesign@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.